How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and today I wanted to share with you all a recent favorite of mine. My good friend Justin from the Everett, Washington band Well Adjusted turned me on to the crust punk hardcore band Oroku. Now, Oroku were not your typical hardcore band, and although I would certainly say they were an above average and underrated band within that circuit, what really set them aside from their peers or even bigger bands in the genre was this incredibly ambitious blend of such a dissonant, extreme breed of hardcore with classical music of all things. Their star musician being a cellist by the name of Lisa Griswold. So I thought I would share what I discovered about them with you all, give you all a rundown on their history, what their music was like, and even some of the other bands the musicians to come and go have also been a part of. But before we do that, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, then may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Just to let you know though, none of Oroku's music is actually available on streaming, so I assembled everything I could find on YouTube into a playlist, and you can find a link to it in the description below and on my channel. Anyways! Now, from what I understand, Oroku got their start sometime in the really early 2000s, or maybe even a little bit before that. They were fronted by a guy named Jeff Milner, who I would assume also started the band and probably had a pretty big hand in their songwriting as well. And Oroku first took shape in Lawrence, Kansas, which, if you don't know, is a very landlocked city near the center of the United States, which falls directly in between the two larger towns of Kansas City and Topeka, sitting roughly 30 to 45 minutes outside of both. However, sometime before or right after their first release in 2004, the band would relocate to the West Coast and settled in my home city of Seattle, Washington. Their debut on record would come in the form of a split 7-inch titled Nothing Can Save You that was done with another incredibly obscure band called the Gamuts Make War, and from what I understand, this is that other band's only ever release. And like I said, the split would be self-issued sometime in 2004, and although is admittedly a bit rough around the edges, certainly showcases a promising start. Or at least a promising enough start to get the band connected with a label called New Audio Terror. Now, this label is even more obscure than Oroku, and although I did my best to try and determine where they got started, I can only estimate there's probably a 60 or so % chance they were based somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and maybe a 40% chance somewhere in the Midwest, likely around the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Having housed releases from a handful of bands native to both regions and the information I would need to confirm the home base of New Audio Terror has unfortunately not been documented online. Thus, the only realistic way to find this out would probably be an insert or back cover from one of the releases issued by this label, unfortunately none of which I happen to own. However, if any of you watching do own any of these records I'm showing on screen here, please feel free to comment below. While we are on this subject though, I also want to note that one of New Audio Terror's bands from this era, Toe Cutter, another hardcore band based out of Seattle, is actually still playing to this day, and very much also worth checking out if you're a fan of extreme punk music. But going back to the main subject at hand, Oroku would make their official debut through this label, dropping a self-titled 3-song 7-inch in the year 2005. And although production-wise this is certainly a very large step up from the self-release split, it still doesn't quite showcase what would come to be known as the band's staple sound, as both of these releases took place prior to the introduction of cellist Lisa Griswold. But just like its predecessor, the 7-inch also displays a band with a great deal of potential. I would say even more so, if at the very least within the context of their underground scene. A particular era of this scene, that is, and one that Oroku's music was more or less perfectly on time for. Coming out of the late 90s, Orange County, California's dystopia had risen to pretty significant prominence, and I would say all of Oroku's early and later material is very much a product of their influence. You're gonna get a lot of down-tuned, heavy guitars, a lot of drawn-out dissonant chord progressions, and of course some almost painfully screamed vocals. The band also expresses a great deal of influence from Memphis, Tennessee's His Hero Is Gone, another crust staple of the late 90s whose impact would very heavily shape the following generation of hardcore bands, Oroku being no exception. And in a lot of their up-tempo material or even faster sections worked into slower tracks, the band's drummer at the time, Tony Spear, wears that influence on his sleeve the most, utilizing a D-beat groove a lot more often than a traditional blast beat, the latter being a trend that, although I would say never fully took over, definitely grew to be exceptionally popular in hardcore during the early aughts.
But while these early releases are certainly appealing to a specific crowd, I at least didn't find them to be exceptionally unique. And the band wouldn't really turn that corner until they, of course, introduced cellist Lisa Griswold. And the real crown jewel of their discography is a 9-track album by the name of Living Through the End Time.
And this record would make its first appearance through New Audio Terror in 2006 and was recorded at the Autopsy Room in Tacoma, Washington. Production duties would be carried out by a musician and audio engineer named Jesse O'Donnell, a guy who would make a bit of a name for himself in the Northwest punk and hardcore scene through both of those endeavors. Most notably is the go-to engineer and, for a short time, guitarist of the Tacoma-founded street punk band Noise, but also through a couple of short-lived hardcore bands of his own called Lahar and Left With Nothing. And Living Through the End Time would be Oroku's first and only release to feature a cello performance from Lisa Griswold. And that, along with the superior production and all-around more seasoned songwriting, I think makes this record shine a great deal more than any of their previous material. The cello creates this really dark sense of melody that, for the most part, is a pretty unexplored writing technique in a lot of hardcore punk in general, but especially within this variety. And during some of the slower tracks, or at least down-tempo parts that feature a lot of chromatic riffing and diminished chords, the cello really gets a chance to take the spotlight. And giving another nod to the band's dystopia influence again, this record has a number of these real ambient, almost atmospheric interludes, placed either in between songs or written into them as transitions. And while these can tend to be the less memorable or even filler parts of other hardcore and crust records, in Oroku's case, they're actually another one of the high points, as these monotone instrumentals serve as the perfect backdrop for the cellist to really shine. And the album's 4th track, Death to the Sufferer, I would say is its first really powerful display of this. Opening up with a somber, slowly drawn-out bass line before the cello enters with a lead melody, and the contrast kind of gives this tune a medieval funeral type of feel, if that makes sense. However, I would say Oroku does this even more effectively on the 7th track, Spineless, which opens with the cello in full isolation for the only time on the record's entire run, and then breaks into a waltzy 6/8 groove, which, as you might imagine, complements it nearly just as well, even with the band's extreme hardcore sound on full display.
Front to back though, this LP is very, very much worth checking out if you're a fan of crust punk, if you're a fan of hardcore in general, or if you're just someone who enjoys weird avant-garde music of any variety. I would certainly say this is a record that more than fits that description. And if you do get the chance to check it out, I should let you know there are actually 2 versions of it. The original vinyl release that, like I said, features 9 tracks, and the later issued CD version, which includes 2 B-sides tacked on at the end. But as I noted earlier, Living Through the End Time would sadly be the only full-length release we would ever get from Oroku. And although the band did keep going for a little while after the record came out, and seemed to have also done a handful of reunion shows, there has been no new music in nearly 20 years. However, that does not mean the past members haven't done so on their own.
So a number of the various musicians to come and go from Oroku over their roughly 10-year run have had some other projects, the most notable of which I would say is probably the post-metal band Mouth of the Architect that guitarist Alex Vernon would spend some time playing with. And prior to joining Oroku, he also contributed some guitar work to the short-lived metalcore unit Dead Blue Sky. I actually really enjoyed their 2001 full-length Symptoms of an Unwanted Emotion, too. There's also, of course, short-time drummer Jesse Schriebman's extremely long resume of metal and hardcore bands, including, but not limited to, The Mackay, Black Hole of Calcutta, and Autophagy. The band's original guitarist, Brian Spinks, would also have a couple of his own post-Oroku endeavors, most of which leaned more in the doom and sludge metal direction, issuing 2 albums with his band Samatrace in the late 2000s and 1 more with with another called Rainbows Are Free in 2014. And last but certainly not least, cellist Lisa Griswold would also collaborate with a handful of other musicians over the years, lending some cello playing to the rap group Twisted Linguistics in 2006 and another hardcore band by the name of Biocrisis in 2012. She also had a pre-Oroku project by the name of Garmin Bozio, one of the two I think, which offered a somewhat similar breed of crusty hardcore, but one that feels a little more retro, seemingly drawing their influence from older bands of that variety like Nausea and Doom. As far as I was able to determine though, we sadly have not gotten any more music from lead vocalist and assumed founder Jeff Milner. That being said, considering his taste in music, I wouldn't find it all that hard to believe if his post-Oroku endeavors have just not gone all that widely documented. So there's always a possibility that he's still somewhere out there making music to this day.
But anyways, I think that about does it for this video. This was just a band and album I found extremely interesting, and I hope you do too, or at the very least get some form of entertainment out of this story, even if that's just finding out that a band like this existed. Like I said, I absolutely love this record. There was clearly a lot of love put into it, and a lot of really skilled, dedicated people involved with creating it, and just in and out of the band throughout all the different turns of their run. So if you get a chance to check it out, please let me know what you think. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, and did you also feel like this is a pretty underrated band? Or maybe you're someone who's already heard of Oroku. Did you ever get a chance to see them? What was your first reaction when you heard the record? Let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.